Peter Pan and his squadron of lost boys may have been a bunch of children, but they sure managed to band together and give Captain Hook the business. In fact, they were so tough and awesome, it almost makes you wonder why the Lost Boys had such a minimal role in Disney's Peter Pan. But after checking out the original source material that was used by Disney to create their magical tale, it's clear to see why they left the boys' backstories out. They might have been just a little too dark for young viewers, especially in the eyes of Disney. The truth behind the Lost Boys was, for the most part, omitted from Disney's animated version of Peter Pan. But after reading the book that the movie was based on, it seems like Peter Pan didn't quite build his troop of orphan children out of the goodness of his heart, but instead he did it as a child who didn't realize that certain actions can lead to terrible tragedies. You see, the Peter Pan story was actually based on a book that was written in 1911 by J.M. Barrie named Peter Pan and Wendy, which was actually based on a play written by the same author. And while the book is very similar to Disney's telling of the story, it does show that there is a bit of a darker aspect to Peter Pan. And it actually seems like this connection with the Lost Boys grew out of Stockholm Syndrome, as there is a chance that the boy from Neverland kidnapped his companions. In the book, as Wendy's brothers Michael and John spent more time with Peter and the Lost Boys, they learned that all of the boys who were there had been taken from a specific park in London. The park was known as Kensington Gardens, and according to the story, all of the Lost Boys somehow fell out of their prams, or strollers, and ended up getting lost for 7 days. And after the 7th day of not being found, Peter supposedly saved them and brought them to Neverland with him. But that story seems to be a little too simple. For one thing, even if the nurse looked away from the stroller, a baby or young child wouldn't be able to unlatch themselves and fall out on their own unless it's something they had practiced doing. And because that's not likely, there's almost this suggestion that Peter actually used his playfulness to lure the children out of their strollers and away from their families or nurses. In fact, this is hinted at by Peter in the book when Wendy realized that there were no girls in the Lost Boys, which is when Peter Pan replied saying that girls are far too clever to fall out of prams. This could very well imply that he had tried to lure young girls out of their strollers and was simply unsuccessful. However, the same couldn't be said for the boys, as Peter seemed to have a miniature army of Lost Boys that he had possibly kidnapped over the years. Interestingly enough, Peter's team up with Wendy and her younger siblings also wasn't something of a chance, and actually might be just as creepy as his reasoning for potentially kidnapping the Lost Boys. In fact, there's a chance that Wendy and the others' circumstances might prove that Peter didn't simply save or adopt these boys, but did kidnap them after all. In the 1954 animated Disney movie, Peter and Wendy met seemingly by happenstance, as the boy who never ages was looking for his shadow in the nursery of her home. However, J.M. Barrie made it seem like less of a coincidence in his novel. According to the original story, Peter Pan, as he flew around London, often stopped at a specific house where he would listen in as the mother who lived in the house told her children all sorts of bedtime stories. Now, bedtime stories were something that Peter Pan clearly loved, and he would have loved to get a storyteller for himself and the Lost Boys that he seemingly lured away from their strollers. The house in question was, of course, Wendy Darling's house, where she lived with the rest of her family. Peter stopped by to look into the window of their nursery and spy on them often, and it even got to the point where he got caught because he tried to break in. The book described the Darling's dog as she caught the boy sneaking into the nursery window, which was when she attacked Peter and managed to latch onto his shadow as he escaped. Now, if you know anything about dogs, it's likely that they're great judges of character, which means that Wendy's dog attacking Peter might have been a sign that the boy from Neverland didn't mean well. Yet another sign that Peter Pan's intentions with the children he collected weren't always pure, and that his playful mannerisms were more of a way for him to kidnap them and take them back to his home forever. Now, according to the book Peter Pan and Wendy, after Wendy discovered Peter sneaking into their house again to steal his shadow back, he learned something about her that made him even more interested in taking her from her home and bringing her back to his island. Peter learned that Wendy was an excellent storyteller and knew a ton of bedtime stories, which to a boy who was eternally youthful was everything that he needed to know about her. And after he invited Wendy and her brothers to Neverland, Peter managed to lure the children away from their families in London, just like he had done to the Lost Boys throughout the years. It's also important to remember that, as of that point in time, none of the Lost Boys had ever been able to return home, which was likely the same plan that Peter had for Wendy and the Darlings. As the siblings got acclimated to life in Neverland, Michael and John, Wendy's brothers, began to grow more comfortable with the Lost Boys. And in the book, all seemed to be going to plan for Peter, as Wendy almost immediately became the mother figure to him and the other Lost Boys. Now, as you know from the animated Disney movie and in the book, it's not much different. Neverland isn't all sunshine and rainbows. And after a few run-ins with Captain Hook and some judgmental mermaids, days, Wendy and her brothers began to get homesick, and while Peter agreed to take them home and even allowed the Lost Boys to get adopted by the Darlings after they'd finally defeated Captain Hook, he wasn't being entirely truthful at first. In fact, it was almost like a continuation of his oddly villainous but childish kidnapping plot. J.M. Barrie depicted Peter using fairy dust to make Captain Hook's ship fly as the kids used it to get home. In Peter Pan and Wendy, the boy had ulterior motives. Peter ended up flying ahead, and according to the book, he planned on placing bars on the Darlings' windows to make it seem like they were unwanted. However, he ended up changing his mind last minute. Either way, though, the fact that he thought about lying to them to keep Wendy and the boys in Neverland practically proved that he was willing to kidnap and force people to stay with him despite the fact that he himself was just a child. Now, it could have just been the added dangers of being in Neverland, or it could have been because Peter was too innocent to understand consequences as serious as life and death. But one thing is clear, he made sure that the Lost Boys were ready to die for him if need be. While this isn't outright stated in the Disney movie or the book Peter Pan and Wendy, it was certainly shown in certain scenes. For instance, in J.M. Barrie's novel, one of the Lost Boys shot Wendy with an arrow as she flew into Neverland simply because Tinkerbell told him that their leader, Peter Pan, said to. Without even questioning it, the young child let loose an arrow that very easily could have taken a life, and that's because Peter didn't know about and never taught the children about real-life consequences, otherwise showing that Peter didn't necessarily care what happened to the children that he potentially kidnapped, something that was only further ingrained each time that the Lost Boys and Peter chose to get into altercations with pirates that were actively trying to kill them. In fact, right before all of the Lost Boys and Wendy left Neverland for good, they had one last big battle with Captain Hook, and in J.M. Barrie's book, the result is much darker than Disney's version. The Lost Boys willingly fought to the death against Captain Hook and his men and managed to take the lives of all but 2 of the pirates on board. And Peter wasn't feeling merciful either, as he sent Captain Hook overboard right into the jaws of the Tick-Tock crocodile. And while taking those particular lives might have been justifiable, it's still something that no children should ever have had to do, and they were practically forced to after being potentially kidnapped by an ageless child who couldn't tell the difference between right and wrong. Now, one last bit of information from J.M. Barrie's novel actually implies that Peter might have kidnapped the Lost Boys without even realizing that one day he would likely forget all about them and leave them stranded on their own. In Peter Pan and Wendy, one of the most childlike aspects of the boy who never ages personality was his youthful forgetfulness. For instance, when he was first flying Wendy and her little brothers to Neverland, he would often veer off course, only to return to the group not to remember who any of them were. And this is actually something that's reinforced all throughout the book, including at the end after Wendy and her family finally returned to London. The book claimed that Peter and Wendy made a deal to always have Wendy visit Neverland on the first week of every spring to help him out with spring cleaning. And while this worked for the first few years, eventually Peter forgot all about Wendy until about 2.5 decades later. It was then that J.M. Barrie explained that the boy who never ages also forgot about his companion Tinkerbell, as well as the Lost Boys that ended up growing up in London with Wendy. Now, think about what would have happened if Peter had never let the Lost Boys stay with Wendy's family and grow up outside Neverland. He likely would have forgotten about them over time because of his childlike memory, and they would have all been left in the middle of Neverland on their own as children forever. All because a boy who couldn't even remember them and who previously kidnapped them in London Park. What do you think? Did Peter Pan actually save the children who supposedly were lost in Kensington Gardens? Or did he lure them out of their stores and kidnap them, not realizing that he was ruining their entire lives? Make sure you let us know in the comments below.